The cold had stopped being painful 3 hours ago. Now it was simply there, a living thing pressed against Elise's skin, seeping through her torn cloak, settling into her bones with each labored breath. She kept one hand locked against the swell of her belly, fingers splayed wide as if she could shield the 5 frantic heartbeats fluttering beneath her palm from the wolves that hunted her through the storm. 5. The healers had called her a liar when she'd first told them. Then they called her cursed. Then they'd driven her out into the snow to die, because the world the Pax had built had no room in it for the kind of power she carried without knowing. The ancient text said it plainly, a silver litter, born once in a generation, capable of reshaping the balance of everything. And so they decided the simple solution was to erase her before the balance could shift. Behind her, cutting through the howl of wind, came the hunting calls, deep, resonant, promising blood. Her former pack had tracked her for 3 days across the frozen wasteland between territories. They wanted her dead. More specifically, they wanted what was inside her dead. 5 impossible lives that broke every law of nature the Pax had known for generations. Elise's boot caught on something buried beneath the snow. She went down hard, knees slamming into frozen ground, the air punched from her lungs. Pain exploded through her swollen body. Not just the cold, not just the fall, and she gasped, the sound swallowed instantly by the screaming blizzard. Get up, she commanded herself. Get up now. They're close. If you stay down, they'll tear these pups from your body before your heart stops beating. She rose. She always rose. She pressed forward into the dark. And then she saw the stones, ancient, rune-carved border markers rising from the snow like the broken teeth of something enormous and sleeping. Beyond them, through the veil of white chaos, the first silver shapes of wolves that were not hunting her, but watching, waiting, utterly still. The cold stopped mattering entirely. Quick pause, comment where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. I've got a lot more coming. She had been running for 3 days. Not the desperate, wild flight of someone who had lost their head. Elisa had never lost her head in her life, but the methodical, agonizing endurance of someone who understood exactly what was behind her and refused to stop moving regardless of cost. The contractions had started that morning, faint and irregular, like a warning she could not afford to heed. She filed them away with the cold and the hunger and the wet that had soaked through her boot 3 hours ago. Later. She would deal with all of it later, when there was a later to deal with. The border stones rose around her suddenly, as if they had been hiding in the dark. She nearly walked into the nearest one, a slab of black granite taller than a man, carved with runes she recognized from old pack histories, protection markings, boundary designations, warnings to those who crossed without permission. Under her palm, the stone was surprisingly warm despite the blizzard. She pressed herself against it and allowed herself 5 seconds of stillness. Just 5. The hunting howls were closer now. She counted 3 distinct voices, the pack leader and 2 enforcers, she guessed, moving in the classic triangulation pattern she'd been trained to recognize as a child. They were good. They'd been herding her toward the stones deliberately, cutting off her options one by one, patient as winter itself, because they knew she was running out of time, because everyone knew what happened when an omega in late pregnancy pushed her body past its limits. She was not going to give them the satisfaction. The black wolves materialized from the storm like nightmares given form, massive, dark-furred, eyes glowing that particular amber gold that meant heightened aggression, full predator instinct engaged. Their leader shifted human between one step and the next, a man built like a siege weapon with a silver blade already drawn. He smiled at her across the border stones as if they were having a pleasant conversation. "It's over, Elisa. Come back peacefully, and we'll make it quick. The pups won't suffer." She had her back against the stone and nowhere left to run. The contractions were no longer faint or irregular. She pressed both hands to her belly and felt 5 distinct rhythms pushing back against her palms, and something fierce and immovable rose up in her chest and settled there like a second heartbeat of its own. "You'll have to kill me first," she said. "And you'll have to mean it." The pack leader took a step forward. Then the air changed. It was the only way to describe it. The atmosphere itself shifted, the pressure dropping the way it did before lightning struck, and every wolf in the hunting pack went still simultaneously. Not cautious, not watchful. Still, the way prey goes still when it recognizes something above it in the food chain. Silver wolves emerged from the other direction, flowing out of the darkness between the stones like liquid moonlight given muscle and intent. Larger than the black wolves, moving with a precision that wasn't urgency but certainty, the kind of movement that belonged to creatures who had never needed to hurry because nothing had ever outrun them. They formed a wall between Elisa and the hunters without a sound. The largest one shifted. He stood in the snow shirtless despite the blizzard, as if the cold were simply a feature of the landscape he'd long since made his peace with. Tall, genuinely tall, not the manufactured height of aggression, but the structural height of a man built to carry enormous weight without breaking. Scars mapped the story of something violent across his chest and left shoulder, not the kind that came from a single dramatic encounter, but the layered record of a life spent in the business of consequences. His hair was long and dark, tied back, stray strands whipping in the storm wind. His eyes, when they found her through the snow, were the color of molten silver, pale and burning simultaneously, focused on her belly with an intensity that cut through the cold like a blade. He said one word. "How many?" Elisa had been lying about herself in small ways her entire life, lying about her strength when she was injured, lying about her fear when she was terrified, lying about her hunger when the pack's rations ran short. She had kept secrets like breath, because breath was how you survived and secrets were the armor you wore when you had nothing else. She could not lie about this. Not to those eyes. Not with 5 lives pressing against her hands and demanding she be honest about what they were. "5," she said. The silence that followed was longer than the storm. The hunter with the silver blade had gone the color of old ash. He took one step backward without appearing to choose to. Behind him, his wolves were already retreating. Not ordered to, not commanded, simply responding to something older than pack law, some atavistic understanding of exactly where they stood in the hierarchy of this particular moment. The Alpha King of the Northern Crown crossed the border stones, knelt in the snow in front of Elisa Salberg, and pressed one enormous, scarred hand to the curve of her belly with a gentleness so complete it was almost frightening. She felt him listen. Actually listen, the way the old seers listened, full body and reverent, like hearing something sacred. When he looked up, something had shifted irrevocably in those silver eyes. "You're coming inside the walls," he said. It was not a question. It was not a command in the way commands were usually given, with force, with the weight of authority, with the implicit threat of what happened if you refused. It was something else entirely. It was a decision that had already been made by something deeper than either of them. "I don't need," Elisa started. "I know," he said. "You don't need anything from anyone. I can see that from here." He held her gaze steadily. "But they do." His eyes moved to her belly. "And they need warmth and walls and a healer. And you're going to let them have that, aren't you? She let him carry her through the border stones. She told herself it was only because her legs had stopped working properly. She told herself that for a long time afterward, warmth was the first thing. Not the remembered warmth of a place she'd once belonged to, but an absolute warmth, the kind that came from walls 3 feet thick and fires built by people who understood cold as an opponent to be actively defeated. Elisa surfaced from something between unconsciousness and sleep to find herself in a bed so vast and so soft it seemed designed to argue against every concept of necessity she'd ever developed. She'd been cleaned, changed into something warm and plain, practical, not ceremonial, she noted with distant approval, and positioned against a bank of pillows with what appeared to be genuine care. Not perfunctory arrangement. Care. She lay still for a moment and simply breathed. Under her hands, 5 heartbeats pushed back. Steadier now. Stronger. She felt the difference immediately, the way they had fluttered with exhaustion during the flight, and the way they moved now, with something that felt almost like comfort. Good, she murmured to them. Rest while you can. I have a feeling things are about to get complicated. She was not wrong. The palace healers arrived within the hour, 3 of them, led by an ancient woman with white braids and the quiet authority of someone who had outlasted every challenge the world had ever presented her. They worked in near silence, careful and thorough, and their faces gave very little away until the confirmation came. 5 distinct heartbeats, perfectly staggered, each strong and separate and indisputably real. The eldest healer sat back on her heels, and the color drained from her face with the slow, deliberate precision of someone receiving news they had been theoretically prepared for and actually were not. The last moonborn quintuplets, she said, and her voice had gone to something between a whisper and a prayer. 73 years ago. They reshaped the pack borders for 3 generations, changed the alliances, changed the bloodlines. She looked at Elisa with an expression that was not quite awe and not quite fear, but contained elements of both. Changed everything. Elisa absorbed this without expression. She had known in the abstract way you knew things you'd read and been warned about, and never quite believed would apply to you, what 5 meant, what a silver litter meant, what the politics of rare blood had meant throughout pack history. She'd known, and it had seemed theoretical, distant, someone else's problem. She was beginning to understand that it had never been theoretical. It had always been coming for her. By evening, the entire court knew. She watched it happen from her window. The ripple effect of information moving through a palace, the small clusters of people in corridors who fell silent when passed by, the exchanged glances across rooms that carried entire conversations in a single second. She had grown up reading those glances. She was fluent in the language of people deciding what to do with a threat. A faction of elder lords occupied the far end of the great dining hall with the practiced ease of men who had been claiming that particular geography for decades. Their faces gave nothing away to casual observers. Elisa was not a casual observer. She watched them from across the room and catalogued everything: the set of shoulders, the angles of bodies leaning slightly together, the mouths barely moving over wine glasses. She's manipulated him, one said. She read it from his lips. End it cleanly, said another, before it goes further. The Alpha King's voice cut through the hall like a blade through still water. She didn't catch the exact words, but she felt their effect immediately. Every one of those careful, conspiratorial bodies went still and recalibrated. The Alpha King said something short and absolute, and the conversation ended the way conversations ended when the person ending them was the last word on all subjects. Later, When the hall had emptied and Reuben crossed to where she stood by the window, she was aware of the exact shape of what was coming for her. She had survived too long on instinct not to recognize it. "They're going to try to kill me," she said, before he could speak. He stopped beside her. He didn't insult her by denying it. "Some of them will try." "Yes." "And you'll stop them?" He looked out at the snow-covered grounds below, at the silver wolves patrolling the walls in the moonlight. "I will stop them," he said. "But you should know that stopping them may not be immediate. Courts move slowly when they want to, and very quickly when it serves them." He looked at her directly. "What I can promise you is this. While you are within my walls, no one will touch you without going through me first." She studied him for a long moment. This man who had materialized from a blizzard and turned the trajectory of everything, who carried the weight of a kingdom and the casual authority of someone who had never once in his life doubted that he would carry it. She was looking for the seam in it, the place where the performance ended and the calculation began. She didn't find one. That frightened her more than the lords with their careful mouths. The cold started in her fingertips. She noticed it on the third morning, a faint, spreading numbness that worked from the outermost edges inward with a patience and purpose that had nothing to do with temperature. The fire in her chamber burned high. She'd layered on every blanket she'd been given. The cold came anyway, moving through her from within, settling specifically in the spaces around each of the 5 heartbeats, as if it were looking for something to extinguish. She said nothing for 6 hours. She pressed herself to the window and breathed carefully and monitored the heartbeats and told herself it was something that would pass. It did not pass. By afternoon she was shaking. Not visibly. She had long practice in controlling visible tremors, but inside, a deep and frightening shuddering that made the heartbeats stutter. The second healer found her on her knees beside the bed, both hands pressed flat to the floor, trying to breathe through something that felt like drowning in cold water. The verdict came quickly, because the eldest healer had suspected it since the moment she'd heard which rooms Elisa had been placed in. The palace wards, ancient things, built during the succession wars when pack politics were bloodier and more brutal than even the current court, had been designed with this specific purpose: the suppression of rare bloodlines, the elimination of unnatural pregnancies, the enforcement of what the builders had decided was the natural order, sealed in stone and runecraft 3 centuries ago and never updated because no one had ever needed to question them. They were trying to kill her pups, and in doing so, they were killing her. 3 days, the eldest healer said, her voice stripped of everything but fact. Perhaps 4 if she's strong. The wards will accelerate as the pregnancy progresses. There is nothing I can do against them from inside this building. The court erupted the way courts always erupted, in the controlled, sophisticated language of people who considered themselves too elevated for open conflict, which meant the open conflict happened slightly below the surface and was twice as vicious for it. Move her. End the pregnancy, humanely. Let nature, meaning the nature their ancestors had encoded in 300-year-old stone, take its course. One nobleman, bolder or stupider than the rest, said it plainly. The wards exist for a reason. If we circumvent them for 1 omega. Elisa spoke from the window. She hadn't meant to. She'd meant to stay quiet, to observe, to be the controlled and strategic person survival had required her to be for her entire life. The words came anyway. Then I'll die trying instead of lying here while your palace murders my children. Her voice was completely steady. She found that interesting. You can watch me walk out through your gates right now if you prefer. I've been managing on my own my entire life. I'll manage this too. The room went silent. Reuben had been standing at the far wall with the stillness she was beginning to recognize, the quality of attention he gave things before he made decisions, which was total and absolute, and gave nothing away. He crossed to the window. He stood beside her for a long moment looking out at the walls, the ancient walls, the stone that had stood for 3 centuries, the palace that was also, it turned out, an assassination weapon. "Nothing is immovable," he said. He knelt to her level. Actually knelt, on the stone floor of his own great hall with half his court watching, so that his eyes were level with hers. Close enough that she could see the silver in them wasn't uniform, was more complex than a color, was the layered record of something ancient and certain. "If the palace won't protect my future," he said, and his voice was very quiet, which she had learned meant he was most serious, "then I will build one that will." She searched his face for the performance, for the calculation, for the political angle of a man who had recognized what 5 silver pups meant for his bloodline and his legacy, and was dressing self-interest in the language of sacrifice. She found none of it. There was only the absolute certainty of a man who had identified something that was wrong and intended to fix it, as simply and completely as that. Something loosened in her chest that she hadn't known was clenched. She did not name it. It was too early, and she was not a fool. But she felt it, the first hairline crack in the armor she'd been building since childhood, and she allowed herself to feel it, privately, with neither judgment nor indulgence. "You can't rebuild a 300-year-old palace in the time I have," she said. "Watch me," said the Alpha King. He announced it the next morning to the assembled court, and the silence that followed was of a quality Elisa had never encountered before. Not the silence of shock or disagreement, but the silence of people who were genuinely trying to determine whether they had heard correctly, and concluding that they had, and not knowing what to do with that information. The eastern wing would be demolished. The wards would be unmade. Runesmiths would be brought from the northern reaches. Moonwood, rare, expensive, deeply inconvenient to source in winter, would replace the ward stones in the foundation. The rebuilding would begin today. It would be completed before the birth. "You would tear down our ancestral palace," one of the elder lords began. "I would tear down the moon," Reuben said quietly, and the room stopped, "if it threatened what is mine." There was no follow-up. There was nothing left to say after that. The Masons arrived before the echo of the announcement had fully faded. Elisa watched from her window, moved now to the western wing, furthest from the old wardstones, where the cold had receded to a manageable whisper, as the first stones of the eastern wall were pulled free. It was startling, the sound of demolition. She'd expected it to feel like destruction. Instead, it sounded like relief, like something old and wrong being undone. Reuben worked alongside his craftsmen. This was the thing she found herself unable to look away from. He was an Alpha King, ruler of the largest territory in the Northern Crown, commander of armies, dispenser of justice, and keeper of law. He had people whose entire purpose was to do physical work in his name. He worked anyway. Not symbolically, not for appearance, not for the 15 minutes it took to make a point, and then retreat to warmer rooms. He worked from dawn until the light failed, hands blistered and bleeding by the 3rd day, covered in stone dust, and the particular exhaustion of honest physical labor. She had people bring her books from the palace library and pretended to read them while watching him through the window. She was aware of the dishonesty of this. She did it anyway. On the 4th evening, he came to her chamber at dusk, still dusty, carrying 2 cups of something hot that smelled of herbs she didn't recognize. He set one beside her on the table without ceremony and sat in the chair across from her bed. "How are they tonight?" he asked. She understood he meant the heartbeats. "Better. Calmer. The old cold is almost gone." She studied him. You don't have to do this yourself, you know. You have an army of craftsmen. I know, he said. Then why? He held the cup in both hands and looked at it for a moment before looking up. Every time I close my eyes, he said, I hear them. 5 heartbeats fighting to exist in a world that has decided they shouldn't. If I sit in a warm room and direct other people to fix the thing I have the power to fix with my own hands, he stopped, shook his head. I am no different than the wolves who hunted you. Different methods. Same indifference to what was right. Elisa didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would have added to it. Outside the window, moonwood beams rose silver in the dark, pale and luminous, fitting into the spaces where the old wardstones had been pulled free with the ease of something that had always been meant to be there. She reached out and covered the back of his blistered hand with her palm, briefly, without looking at him. He went very still. Thank you, she said, for hearing them. She withdrew her hand before he could respond. But the warmth of the gesture stayed in the room long after she'd turned back to the window. Lord Cosm had been a patient man his entire political life. Patience was, he had always believed, the most underrated weapon in any arsenal, superior to violence, superior to wealth, superior even to information, because patience was what determined when and how all the other weapons were deployed. He had waited out 3 Alpha Kings before Reuben. He had watched younger men make faster moves and burn bright and die fast. He was not going to make that mistake. The chamber beneath the oldest wing was stone cold and completely forgotten, one of half a dozen rooms that appeared in none of the palace maps the court used, a legacy of the original builders who had understood that architecture could keep secrets as well as any human tongue. Lord Cosm had discovered it 30 years ago. He had been waiting for the occasion to use it. It appeared the occasion had arrived. There were 7 lords assembled. Not the full conspiracy. He would never commit the full conspiracy to a single room simultaneously. Too much risk in that, but the core of it, the men who had calculated most clearly what 5 silver pups on the throne would mean for the settled order they'd spent their careers maintaining. Reuben cannot be touched, Lord Cosm said, before anyone else could introduce a more aggressive option. That is not sentiment. It is strategy. We move against Reuben, we lose everything. His wolves are loyal past reason, his reputation is immovable. We become traitors. The D. He let that settle. The Omega, however, is another matter. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Manufactured rebellion in the Eastern Territories, plausible, drawn from genuine tensions that had been simmering for years and would only need the smallest push to boil. Reuben would have no choice but to respond personally. The rebels would insist on it. While he was gone, the eastern gates, lightly guarded during the Reconstruction chaos, would be left open during the shift change. The Black Wolves had been waiting beyond the border since the Alpha King had turned them back at the stone markers. They were motivated. They were experienced. And they had a particular hatred for Elisa Salberg that went beyond politics into something more atavistic and absolute, which meant they would not hesitate when the moment came. When Reuben returns to find his project ended, he will need guidance, Lord Cosm said. He will grieve. He will rage. But he will have no proof of our involvement. And in time, he will need his counsel. He always has. A raven went out that night, small and fast and unremarkable, carrying a message in a cipher the Black Wolves' commander had provided 6 weeks ago. The message was 3 words. She's vulnerable. Strike. On the other side of the palace, Elisa could not sleep. She sat in the restored chamber. Warm now, the old cold entirely gone since Reuben had pulled the last of the wardstones from the foundation and pressed her palm to the new wall beside her bed. The moonwood was warm under her touch in a way stone never was, and responsive in a way that was still new enough to startle her. A faint vibration, almost like breath, like the building was aware of her presence and attending to it. She'd mentioned it to the eldest healer 3 days ago, who had gone very still, and then very carefully said that the Alpha King had specified, when commissioning the runesmiths, that the new wards be keyed to the Omega's blood, not to the pack bloodline, not to the throne, to her, specifically, to the particular resonance of her biology, which meant the palace would recognize her as its heart and respond accordingly. She hadn't known what that meant then. She pressed her palm to the moonwood now and felt it pulse gently back and thought she was beginning to understand. Whatever was built into these walls was hers. Completely and irrevocably hers. The thought should have been comforting. Instead, she lay awake listening to the distant sound of construction finishing and the closer sound of something that might have been, but was probably not, a raven leaving in the dark. The rider arrived at dawn, which was when the worst news always arrived, when sleep deprivation and cold and the particular vulnerability of early light made people more likely to accept urgency without examining it too carefully. 3 villages burned. Rebel wolves at the eastern border. A formal demand that the Alpha King attend personally, or the rebellion would be named a war. Reuben spent 11 minutes examining the reports. Elisa watched him do it. The focused stillness, the way he read with his whole body, not just his eyes. Then he set the papers down and looked across the room at her with an expression she couldn't fully parse, which was unusual. She'd become surprisingly good at reading him in a short time. 3 days, he said. For at most.
Go, she said.
Elisa. You're an Alpha King. You don't need my permission to handle a rebellion. I know that. He crossed the room with the unhurried certainty of his movement. I want to explain it to you. That's different from needing permission. She looked up at him. Why? He appeared to consider this question seriously. Because you have spent your entire life with people making decisions about you without explaining them, without consulting you, without giving you enough information to protect yourself. Because you are not a person things happen to. You are a person who acts. And you need accurate information to act accurately. She stared at him for a long moment. She felt the hairline crack in her armor widen slightly. 3 days, she said finally. I'll be here when you get back. He left her a knife. Simple and sharp, the kind with no decorative elements, no ceremony, no sentiment attached to the object, just utility, just the implicit trust that she would know when to use it and how. He placed it on her nightstand without comment, and she understood exactly what it meant. Not a weapon against external threats only. Every layer of threat covered. Trust in her judgment complete. She fell asleep that night with her hand resting beside it, not touching it, but close. She woke at some point in the deep part of the night. The fire had burned low. The chamber was all amber and shadow, and the particular quality of silence that came just before something broke it. Her guard was not in the corridor. She registered this before she was fully awake, the specific absence of the footstep pattern she'd memorized over 2 weeks, the sound of someone present, and attending replaced by nothing. Just wind through stone. And then so faint it might have been imagination, movement. Precise. Deliberate. The kind of movement that knew exactly where it was going. She put her hand on the knife. She did not pick it up yet. She pressed her other palm to the moonwood wall and waited. The palace breathed against her hand.
Warm.
Alert. I know, she murmured to it, and to the 5 lives listening beneath her heart. I know. We're not done yet. The war horn sounded at the 3rd hour past midnight, 3 long blasts that cut through the palace silence, like silver through bone. Elisa was already awake. She was already on her feet. The contraction hit at the same moment, a long, deep wave that took her breath cleanly and left her gripping the bedpost for 30 seconds that seemed to occupy a great deal more time than 30 seconds mathematically should. When it released her, she was wet, the sheets were wet, and everything that had been a distant eventuality had become an immediate reality. Her water had broken. Labor had begun. And somewhere in the palace below her, she could hear wolves. Not the silver wolves of the Northern Crown, the heavy, rhythmic patrol movement she'd come to recognize as safety. These were different, faster, erratic. The movement of predators who had passed inside a boundary they hadn't expected to pass and were moving quickly before the window closed. She stripped off her soaked nightgown with methodical efficiency and pulled on the wool dress she'd left folded on the chair. Practical, mobile. She wasn't going anywhere. She understood that 5 lives were about to demand everything her body had, but she would not labor in something that hindered movement. She found her boots. She laced them. Her hands were completely steady. The birthing bed was against the eastern wall, positioned directly beneath the open skylight that the eldest healer had insisted on, because moonlight mattered for silver pups, had always mattered, had been one of the first things dismantled by packs who wanted to weaken rare bloodlines, and the last thing the rinsmiths had restored. Through it, she could see the full moon, enormous and absolutely present, pouring light through the gap like a river finding its course. She crossed to the bed. Saturday. Pressed her palm to the moonwood wall. He built you for us, she said to the palace. He pulled 3 centuries of stone apart and built you new, and he keyed you to my blood because he understood what we were going to need. Another contraction rose. She breathed through it, voice steady throughout. So, I need you to do what you were built to do.
Right now.
Please. The palace warmed under her hand. It warmed, and then it hummed, deep and resonant, the way the great ward stones had hummed before they'd been unmade. But this was different, responsive instead of restrictive, alive to her rather than working against her. She felt it like recognition, like something enormous and patient saying, I hear you. The door crashed open. 3 black wolves in human form, massive, battle-trained, eyes carrying that flat amber light of absolute intent. The leader crossed the threshold with a blade already drawn and a smile that had nothing human in it.
Finally, he said.
Time to end this abomination. He stepped fully inside. The palace ignited. Silver fire erupted from every surface simultaneously, walls, floor, ceiling, the moonwood beams blazing with cold light that was not fire in any natural sense but something older and more absolute, responding not to ancient protocols of suppression but to the Omega giving birth beneath the skylight, to her blood singing in the new wards, to the 5 lives demanding that the world make room for them whether or not the world had decided to cooperate. The leader burned. Not slowly, not the theatrical burning of revenge stories, but the immediate and total combustion of something that had come against something bigger than itself and lost all at once. His companions crumbled before they reached the corridor. Elisa barely noticed. The first pup was crowning. The first pup was a girl. She was tiny, impossibly, defiantly tiny, with dark hair and fingers that curled immediately and fiercely around Elisa's index finger the moment she touched them, as if she'd been waiting her entire brief existence for something solid to hold on to. Her cry split the silver-lit air with the absolute authority of someone who had survived something extraordinary and intended to make that fact known. I know, Elisa said to her, laughing and crying simultaneously in a way she had no control over. I know. You can be as loud as you want. You've earned it." Beyond the chamber walls, the palace continued its work. She could hear it, the cascading silver fire moving through corridors as more of the black wolves tested the perimeter. Each breach met with the same absolute response. She'd stopped counting. The palace was counting for her. The second pup was a boy, born fast and furious, squalling before he was fully arrived. The third was a girl, slower, more deliberate, who opened her eyes almost immediately and looked around with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. Elisa felt the fourth contraction begin and reached for the wall and felt the palace steady her, genuinely steady her, a warmth that moved through the stone and into her bones and held. One more after this, she told herself. One more, and then one more after that, and then you're done, and they're all here, and everything that comes after this can deal with itself. The roar split the night. She heard it through the palace walls and the silver fire and the sound of her own labor, a sound she'd never heard from him directly, had only imagined from the stories, deep and carrying and absolute in its violence, the particular voice of a man who had come home to something he needed to protect and found it in danger. The rage in it was complete. But so was something else, something desperate, something that knew the difference between arriving in time and arriving too late. She heard him tear through the invaders at the palace gate. She heard the silence that came after, the specific quality of stillness that meant the opposition had been entirely resolved. She heard footsteps, heavy, fast, controlled, ascending the stairs with a certainty that knew exactly where it was going. The door opened. He stood in the doorway covered in blood that was not his, armor half removed, eyes wild and scanning until they found her alive, found her fighting, found her with 3 pups already in her arms and the 4th arriving, and the expression that crossed his face was something she had no existing category for. She would think about it for the rest of her life and still find it difficult to describe. It was not relief, exactly. It was bigger than relief. It was a man confronting the full weight of what he would have lost and finding against everything that he hadn't. He crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside her without any apparent concern for the blood or the stone floor or the fact that he had just fought his way through an invading army. "You came back," she said. "Always," he said, and his hand found hers. "I will always come back." His hands, large, scarred, still carrying the evidence of everything he'd just done, were steady and certain and exactly right as the 4th pup arrived into them. He looked down at his son with an expression that had nothing of the alpha king in it and everything of a man who had never, not once, known what this felt like until now. "Hello," he said, very quietly.
"I'm Ruben."
"I've been hearing about you." The 5th pup took her time. Elisa had expected this, somehow, had known, in the way she'd known things throughout this pregnancy that she couldn't have explained and hadn't tried to, that the last would be different. The 4 who'd come before had fought their way out with the urgency of people who had been waiting too long and intended to make up for lost time. The 5th was deliberate, present, moving through the process of arrival with a patience that seemed impossible for a newborn and was in fact the clearest indicator of exactly what she was. Ruben's hand never left hers. He'd cleaned his hands, cleaned the pups, arranged the older 4 in the curve of Elisa's free arm with a competence that surprised her until she remembered that he'd grown up the eldest of 7 siblings in a warrior pack and had the look of someone who understood how to care for things that were very small and very important. He was utterly at ease with it. She found that extraordinary and did not say so. When the 5th came, it was exactly at the zenith of the full moon. The light through the skylight was so concentrated it seemed almost solid, a column of silver falling directly onto the birthing bed, onto Elisa's exhausted body, onto the tiny form that arrived into Reuben's waiting hands with a sound that was not exactly a cry. It was, the eldest healer would say later, more like a bell. A single pure note that rang through the chamber, and then through the palace, and then, by the accounts of everyone present in the grounds that night, outward through the walls and into the dark and up toward the moon it had apparently been born to answer. The silver-touched fur was unmistakable, not a marking or a pattern, but an actual luminosity, a faint light in the downy newborn coat that pulsed gently in rhythm with the moonlight above. The eldest healer made a sound Elisa had never heard from her before. Reuben looked at his youngest daughter, and his expression was beyond anything language had built adequate architecture for. The palace went silent. Then every remaining invader, the ones who held back from the walls, the ones sheltering at the gate, the handful who'd found hiding places in the outer buildings, fell where they stood, all at once, as if a single command had been issued and their bodies had complied before their minds had time to argue. The wards had registered completion. 5 lives born, 5 futures secured, the work finished. The battle ended in the same breath as the last birth. Reuben held his smallest daughter for a long moment in the silver moonlight, and then he brought her to Elisa and placed her in the space between them and looked at all 5, one by one, unhurried, as if he were memorizing something he would need to carry for the rest of his life. When the conspirators were dragged in, bound and emptied of every performance of dignity they'd maintained throughout their careers, Reuben did not rise. He stayed where he was, beside Elisa, his hand covering hers. He looked at Lord Cosm with an expression that was not rage. Rage would have been more comfortable for everyone present, but a perfect, bottomless clarity. "You conspired to murder an Omega in labor," he said. His voice was completely even. "You manufactured a rebellion to draw me away from the palace and open my gates to black wolves while my mate gave birth. You have been patient and careful and very clever." He paused. "Take them to the executioner's block." Lord Cosm opened his mouth. Reuben's eyes moved to him once more, and Lord Cosm closed it again. They were taken out. It was done. Dawn came the way it came after the longest nights, not gradually, not gently, but with the decisive authority of something that had been waiting a long time and intended to make its presence fully felt. The light moved through the rebuilt palace differently than it had in the old structure, warmer, more complex, finding angles the original design had never allowed for, illuminating things the original builders had specifically kept in shadow. Elisa slept for 4 hours, which was not enough and was all she had. She woke to the sound of 5 distinct breathing patterns, each slightly different, each already as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. The eldest healer had arranged the cradles in a semicircle around the bed, close enough to reach without rising, far enough to give each pup its own space. She lay still and listened to all 5 of them and felt something enormous and quiet settle into the architecture of who she was and remain there. This was what she had run through the blizzard for. This. All 5 of them breathing. By mid-morning, she had been asked repeatedly if she was ready, and had said she was not, and had then said she was, and had then allowed herself to be carried to the great hall on a litter draped in silver silk, not because she was incapable of walking, and not because it was ceremonial, but because the eldest healer had said in a tone that permitted no negotiation, "Your body gave everything last night. It deserves to be carried." Elisa had decided not to argue with that. The court was assembled. The full court, lords and warriors and servants and craftsmen, and the rinsmiths who'd arrived from the north, and the masons who'd rebuilt the eastern wing, and the silver wolves who'd formed the wall at the border stones on a night that felt both recent and very long ago. The room was full of people who had witnessed the last several weeks and understood that they were standing in a moment that would be recounted to their grandchildren. Reuben descended from the dais. He did not make her come to him. He walked the length of the great hall to where her litter had been set down, and he knelt. Before everyone. Before the assembled court of the Northern Crown. Before the warriors who'd followed him into every battle. Before the nobles whose approval he had never required but had always maintained. He went to one knee on the stone floor and looked up at the woman on the litter, who was looking back at him with eyes that held everything she was still learning to allow herself to feel. You came to my borders hunted, rejected, carrying lives the world had decided were impossible, he said. His voice carried through the hall with the ease of a man who had never needed amplification in his life. You survived winter and wolves and a palace that spent 3 centuries trying to eliminate precisely what you carried. You gave birth during a siege while an army broke against the walls you were built into. You refused to fall. The hall was absolutely still. The only sound was 5 small, soft breathing patterns from the cradles arranged behind the litter. You are not an omega under my protection, Reuben said. You are not a ward of this crown or a political calculation or a problem to be managed. You are my mate, my equal, my Luna. A pause. If you'll have me. Elisa looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the blizzard. She thought about the border stones and the cold and the 3 days of running and everything she'd armored herself against over the course of a lifetime that had not, it turned out, prepared her for this. She thought about a man pulling a 300-year-old palace apart with his own blistered hands. I'll have you, she said. Obviously. The hall exhaled. She named them in the golden morning light with Reuben's hand covering hers and the court witnessing, and the 5 cradles behind her holding all 5 futures. Saren, for the stillness before storms, for the quiet fierceness of a girl who had curled her fingers around the world and refused to let go. Fin, for the boy who had arrived furious and would remain so, she suspected, throughout a life that was going to be enormous. Lyra, for the girl who had opened her eyes immediately and looked around with the focused intelligence of someone who had arrived with a purpose and intended to execute it. Kai, for Reuben's son, born into his father's hands, who had looked up at the man holding him with an expression of ancient recognition that had made the Alpha King's voice go unsteady for the first time since any of them had known him. And the smallest, the silver-touched one, the one who had arrived at the zenith of the full moon with a voice like a bell. Nova, Elisa said, for what comes after the dark. Reuben repeated it.
Nova.
The word moved through the hall the way the 5th pup's cry had moved through the palace, outward and upward, past walls, into something larger. The palace was renamed that day, the Palace of 5 Moons. Not by proclamation, not by ceremony, but by Reuben standing in the great hall and stating it as settled fact, which was how he made most things settled. It would stand in the histories, he said, so that every generation would know what had happened here, so that no one who came after them would be able to claim that impossible was a permanent condition. That night, Elisa stood beneath the open skylight in the rebuilt chamber, the new stone warm against her bare feet, the moonwood walls pulsing gently with the recognition of a palace that knew her as its heart, and looked at 5 cradles, 5 sleeping pups. The silver glow of Nova's coat in the moonlight, steady and soft. The dark hair of Saren. The clenched, fierce fists of Fun. Lyra already with her eyes half open, still taking inventory. Kai making the small, determined sounds of a boy who had ideas about the world and was going to make them known shortly. Reuben's arm was warm around her waist. He did not speak, which was one of the many things she was coming to understand about him, that he knew when words were beside the point, when presence was the complete thing, and anything added to it would only diminish it. "They'll write stories about tonight," he said eventually, because he was not entirely able to resist. Elisa watched the moonlight paint silver across her sleeping children. 5 impossible lives, 5 futures that the world had tried in every available way to prevent. 5 people who would grow up in a palace built specifically around the fact of their existence. Let them, she said, because she had lived the impossible. And tomorrow she would do it again. And the day after that, and every day that followed, in a palace that would remember for 300 years what one Omega had been willing to endure, and what one Alpha King had been willing to tear down, in order to give 5 lives the chance to be. Under the full moon, 5 small voices breathed. In the palace of 5 moons, the Alpha King and his Luna stood together in the silver light and held everything they had built. It was enough. It was everything. It was only the beginning. 3 days after the naming ceremony, when the last of the ash had been cleared from the palace grounds and the gates repaired and the silver wolves doubled at every post, Elisa asked to see the executioner's records. Reuben did not ask why. He sent for them. She read through the names of the conspirators with the same methodical quiet she brought to everything. Not grief, not satisfaction, not the theatrical reckoning of someone who had been waiting for vengeance. Just the careful accounting of a woman who needed to know exactly what had been done and exactly what remained. When she set the last page down, she was quiet for a long moment. "Were there others?" she asked. "Beyond the 7. Reuben was at the window, watching the grounds below where the masons were finishing the last section of new wall. "There were sympathizers," he said. "Men who knew or suspected and said nothing. That is a different category." "What do you do with that category?" He turned from the window. "I watch them," he said, "and I make very clear in every decision I make going forward what the cost of that particular silence was. Some men respond to consequence. Some respond to example. I intend to provide both." She nodded slowly. It was the answer of someone who understood governance, not as a performance of power, but as a long and patient work of consequence and recalibration. She was beginning to understand that this was who he had always been, before her, before the pups, before the palace reconstruction. The man who had heard 5 heartbeats in the snow and made an irrevocable decision had not been transformed by the event. He had simply been revealed by it. She found she had very little to say to that, and so she said nothing, and he returned to the window, and between them in the quiet room the 5 cradles breathed their 5 distinct rhythms, and it was enough. The eldest healer came that afternoon with the formal record of the births, names, times, the precise quality of the moonlight at each arrival, the ward readings from the new stones. She set it on the table beside Elisa's bed with the reverence of someone depositing a document at a place of worship. "In 73 years," she said, not for the first time, but with a different quality now, less awe, more something that sounded like it had been building toward this for her entire career. "Nothing like this has occurred. The histories will debate the implications for a generation." "Let them," Elisa said. She had Kai in the crook of her left arm and Nova against her chest with her silver-dusted fingers curled against Elisa's collarbone. "What I want to know is what they eat in 4 weeks, and whether these wards will hold through summer solstice." The eldest healer blinked. Then she laughed, a sound that came up from somewhere deeply unexpected and surprised them both. "You are the most pragmatic mother of a silver litter I have ever encountered. I'm the only mother of a silver litter you've ever encountered." "Yes," said the healer. "That's rather my point. The first formal audience after the naming was held on the 5th day. Elisa attended, which had not been the plan. The plan had involved several more weeks of recovery and gradual reintroduction to court functions, a careful and diplomatic easing back into public life. The plan had been made by people who had not yet fully understood that Elisa Salberg did not ease into things. She arrived in the great hall in the gray wool she preferred, her dark braids pinned back, no jewelry and no ceremonial adornment except the simple silver band Reuben had placed on her wrist the morning after the naming. Not a performance piece, he'd said, just so that anyone who wasn't sure knew. She sat at his right hand at the dais and held Saren in her arms because Saren had decided against sleeping and someone needed to be responsible for that decision's consequences. The assembled court watched her arrive with a range of expressions she catalogued in the first 30 seconds and filed away for future reference. Genuine awe from the craftsmen and masons who had built the walls that had, in the end, fought for her. Wary recalibration from the surviving nobles who had not been conspirators but had also not been allies. And from the warriors, the silver wolves who had stood at the border stones in the blizzard and at the gates on the night of the siege, something that looked, unmistakably, like recognition. They recognized a fighter. That was the simplest way to describe it. She had done what they understood. She had held a position under siege with no reinforcements and refused to yield, and they had the professional respect of people who knew exactly how difficult that was. She had not expected to care about that. She found that she did, a little. She filed that away too. The audience proceeded. Territory disputes, resource petitions, a border renegotiation with a neighboring pack that had sent an envoy to observe the new political landscape of the Northern Crown. Reuben handled each with the same focused economy she'd come to expect from him. No theater, no performance, just the clear and consistent application of principles she was beginning to understand ran very deep in him. When he consulted her, he did it without preamble, turning to her between petitions and asking for her read on a face, a claim, a subtle shift in posture that she'd caught and he'd missed. She gave it plainly. He incorporated it without ceremony. The envoy from the neighboring pack watched this exchange with visible fascination. At the conclusion of the audience, he asked, through proper channels, whether the Luna would be available for a separate consultation. Reuben said she would if she chose to be. She chose to be. The consultation lasted 40 minutes and covered 3 territorial ambiguities that had been generating quiet friction for a decade. She resolved 2 of them in the first 20 minutes by asking questions no one had apparently thought to ask, and the third by pointing out, with the directness of someone who had very little patience for problems that had been allowed to persist out of diplomatic inertia, that the original boundary markers could simply be moved 6 feet east, and the entire dispute would become logistically irrelevant. The envoy left with the particular expression of a man who had arrived expecting a figurehead and encountered something considerably more substantial. Reuben, who had been present throughout, said nothing until the envoy had gone. "You've done this before," he said then. "Not an accusation. An observation. Negotiated, seen what other people miss, and used it to end things that didn't need to continue." She considered this. "When you have no power in a formal sense," she said, "you develop other tools. Watching. Understanding what people actually want versus what they say they want. Finding the solution that lets everyone walk away with something, because the alternative in a pack where an Omega has no standing to enforce anything is usually worse for the Omega." She paused. "I had a lot of practice." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried that particular weight it had when he was saying something he had thought through carefully. "I spent a great deal of time," he said, "building walls around this kingdom, fortifying, reinforcing, making it very clear that nothing came in and nothing went out without my express authorization." He looked at her. "I think I was solving the wrong problem." She met his eyes. "What was the right problem?" "Building something worth defending," he said, "instead of just defending it." A month after the birth, a delegation arrived from the south, representatives of the pack councils that had driven Elisa out. They came under diplomatic protocol, which was the only reason the gate was open to them at all, and they brought formal apologies drafted by 7 different council heads and sealed with 7 different marks. Elisa received them in the chamber that overlooked the rebuilt eastern wing, with all 5 pups in their cradles behind her and Reuben standing at the wall to her left, not seated, not positioned at any kind of formal distance, simply there, present, attentive, and absolutely immovable. The lead delegate was a woman Elisa recognized, Elder Marit, who had been in the room when the healers confirmed 5 heartbeats, and who had been the first to use the word abomination, who had helped draft the exile order, who had signed it. Elder Marit looked at the 5 cradles. She looked at Elisa. She looked at the moonwood walls with their quiet silver pulse, and the Alpha King standing at the wall like a fact of nature. She looked, in short, at everything that had happened since the decision she'd made, and the full weight of it was visible in her face. Not remorse exactly, but the particular expression of someone who had made a calculation that had been catastrophically wrong and was now in the room with the evidence. She delivered the apology. It was formally correct. It covered every procedural failure, every breach of pack law that the exile had represented, every obligation toward a pregnant Omega that the council had abdicated. It was, by every formal standard, complete. Elisa let her finish. Then she said, "The apology is accepted." Elder Marit blinked, visibly thrown by the absence of conditions, of demands, of the extended negotiation she had clearly prepared for. "Just accepted? You came a long way," Elisa said. "You drafted a formal document. You used the correct language and covered the correct failures. I'm not going to make this into a performance of my own power at your expense." She held the elder's gaze steadily. "But I will say this once, and I'll say it clearly. What happened to me will not happen to another Omega in your territory. Not once. Not under any circumstances. Not because of a bloodline or a litter count or a reading of natural law that was written by people who were afraid of what rare things could become. If it does," she did not look at Reuben, did not gesture toward the silver wolves outside the window or the palace walls or any of the apparatus of consequence available to her. She simply held Elder Marit's eyes and let the sentence finish itself. Elder Marit left with a different expression than she'd arrived with. It was not entirely comfortable. Elisa thought that was probably appropriate. After the delegation had gone, Reuben was quiet for a long time in the way he was quiet when he was revising something, not processing but actively rewriting. "You didn't ask for anything," he said finally. "I didn't need anything from them. Most people in your position would have. Most people in my position spent their lives needing things from people who refused to give them," she said. "I'm done negotiating from need. If I ask for something now, it'll be because it's the right thing, not because I'm trying to recoup a debt." He crossed the room. He stood in front of her and looked at her for a long moment with those silver eyes that had first found her through a blizzard and had not, since that night, looked away. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever met," he said. She looked up at him. Behind her, Nova made a small sound in her sleep, that faint bell-like quality, even in dreams. Saren's fingers twitched. Finn was already making the determined face that suggested opinions forming. "I know," Elisa said, and the corner of her mouth curved. "Obviously." He laughed. The sound filled the chamber the way the moonlight filled it, completely, and with the quality of something that had always been meant to be there. Outside the rebuilt walls of the Palace of Five Moons, the northern crown stretched white and vast, and full of the particular potential of things that were in the process of becoming. The world that had decided Elisa Salberg should not exist was in the process of learning to contend with the world she was going to build instead. That process would be long, and it would be complicated, and there would be days harder than the blizzard and nights darker than the siege. She was ready for all of it. She pressed her palm to the moonwood wall one last time that evening, not out of necessity, not because she needed its warmth or its recognition or its reminder that something in the world had been built specifically to hold what she was. She pressed her palm to it because it was hers, and she was learning slowly against a lifetime of evidence to the contrary that some things were allowed to simply be that. The palace breathed gently back. 5 cradles. 5 futures. One woman who had run through the dark and refused to stop. The rest, as they would say for 300 years after, was history.